How do you type yourself according to Carl Jung's psychological types, his original work, without as little modification to that work as possible? First of all, you can derive 16 types out of his original work. That is possible. It's generally um, 4 functional types and 2 attitude types for each of the functional type. That would be 8 types. But it is possible, based on what Carl Jung wrote about the auxiliary function, to derive 16 types. So in that sense, Isabel Myers is pretty accurate in that you can sort of derive 16 types from his typology. Um, Isabel Myers, however, I've read her work and how she has interpreted Carl Jung, and I've also read how David Keirsey describes how Isabel Myers interprets Carl Jung. I think she's doing a mistake in the sense that she's trying to over rationalize what he meant by the function and the attitudinal orientations of the functions into, like, for example, introverted thinking versus extroverted thinking. So Isabel Myers is stuck in this sort of, what's the auxiliary function? Because Carl Jung talks about an auxiliary function. He talks about a dominant function, and he talks about an auxiliary function. But then Isabel Myers gets into this sort of, is the auxiliary function the opposite attitude, i.e. extroverted, introverted, versus the dominant function? And she tries to overinterpret Jung and say that it is, if the dominant function is introverted, for example, then the auxiliary must be extroverted. And Jung implies this here and here and here in his psychological types. Now, I've read psychological types. I've read it, the parts where he talks about this stuff many, many times. I don't interpret it at all like Isabel Myers does. There are other Jungian analysts. I'm not a Jungian analyst, but there are other Jungian analysts who don't interpret it in the same way as Isabel Myers does. I don't even interpret it in the sense that, for example, an INTP, for example, that an INTP is only using introverted thinking. That's not how I interpret Jung at all. I interpret it like an introverted thinking type is a type that has a differentiated thinking function and whose attitude is mainly introverted. That's very different. So that boils us down to the question, how do we really type ourselves according to the original work of Carl Jung? And in this video, I'm going to provide you with my interpretation of how I would interpret Carl Jung's work. The first thing you have to do if you want to type yourself according to psychological types is to understand your attitude, if you are an extroverted type or an introverted type. Make no mistake about the fact that extroversion and introversion is the big focus point of Jung's psychological types. He derives the concepts of extroversion and introversion basically in 300 plus pages, where he explains it from medieval history, philosophy, a perspective of poetry, etc. Extroversion and introversion is completely essential. You need to box yourself into one of those general attitudes. I'm not going to go into extroversion and introversion in depth here, but what it basically means is the general trend of the movement of libido. Libido is psychic energy. So if your libido is generally moving outward, then you're an extroverted type. Your attitude is focused towards the object or the external world. If your libido is generally moving inward, you are generally focused on the subjective factor or your inner world. So that's the first thing you need to understand. When you know your attitude type, you need to understand the four basic psychological functions. And this is how Jung words it. Four basic psychological functions: thinking and feeling, sensing and intuition. Sensing and intuition are what Jung calls irrational functions. Those are basically perception functions, how we see the world. Thinking and feeling are rational functions because they put a judgment on the world, so they are judging functions. Again, sensing and intuition are learning or perception functions, irrational functions. Thinking and feeling are rational or judgmental or decision-making functions. All right, so if you have understood which attitude type you're an extrovert or an introvert, Jung provides a better description of extroversion and extroverted types, introversion and introverted types than any other literature I've read on the matter. So if you read Jung's literature, you will have some sort of internal understanding of which one you generally are. And it's a general attitude, which means that it's a general direction of libido. So it means that you will not always be extroverted. It's just a general direction of libido, which is outward if you're an extrovert or inward if you're an introvert. So when you have determined that, you need to determine which functional type you are. How do you do this? And this is where a lot of people are making a mistake, because Jung talks about the most differentiated function. Your primary function, sensing, intuition, thinking, or feeling, is your most differentiated function. What is a differentiated function? A differentiated function is a function that can exist separate from the other functions. A function that is so pure in its form that it suppresses the other functions to a low mode level so that you see the purity of the function in a person, in a sense. That is the most differentiated function. And now all of your functions are differentiated to a certain degree. The least differentiated function is your most inferior function. The most differentiated function is your dominant function, or Jung also uses the term superior function. So how do you determine this? Jung doesn't give you a model. I guess it's just introspection. Ask yourself, which one are you really, and how have you been throughout your life? So one example could be, for example, thinking. If you are not that sure about sensing and intuition, you use both. But when it comes to thinking and feeling, you are very, very, very strongly a thinker, and you really suppress feeling and everything else when you're thinking. That could be an indication of the fact that you're thinking dominant. And then if you know your attitude, for example, that you're an extroverted type and you're thinking dominant, then you're an extroverted thinking type. So another example would be if you really are all about perception, you really like to philosophize or learn about theories, abstract things, spirituality, mystical data, and things like that. That is a sign that you have a preference for intuition. So you really like that, and you don't like the sensory, concrete data at all. You suppress that a lot. Whilst in thinking and feeling, you're not really sure which one you prefer because you do both. Then that's a sign that you might be intuitive. That intuition is your most differentiated function. And if you know your attitude on that, then you would be, for example, if you're an introverted type and you have a strong preference for intuition and that is differentiated, then you're an introverted intuitive type, according to Jung's typology. All right, so if you have determined first your attitude type, which is either extroverted or introverted, and after that you have determined your functional preference, or you could say your dominant function or your most differentiated function, your superior function. Jung uses different words for this. Um, that's one of 4 functions. You pair the attitude with the function, and then you have your general Jungian type, and there are 8 types. What about the auxiliary function? Yes, Jung writes about 3 pages on the matter, and these pages have been very, very, very interpreted by Jungian analysts and Catherine Briggs and Isabel Myers. I'm not gonna try to put too much interpretation into the auxiliary function, except what Jung actually says. He says that besides your most dominant function or your most differentiated function, there is a function of secondary importance which is also to a certain degree differentiated. It's never as differentiated as your dominant function, but it is also more differentiated than the other more archaic or primitive functions. This is your auxiliary, and it provides a complement to your most differentiated function. He also explains it in that way that if you are a rational type, which means you're a thinker or a feeler, then your auxiliary function will be irrational. Just as if you're an irrational type, you are a sensor or an intuitive, your auxiliary function will be rational thinking or feeling. And that gives us 16 types. And this is where I think Isabel Myers is correct and also very, very brilliant in her typology, because I think this is a correct interpretation of what Jung wrote, because he actually wrote it. However, he didn't talk about the attitude of the auxiliary function. He just said that it is in every way different from the dominant function, but it is not antagonistic of the dominant function. So for example, if intuition is your dominant function, you cannot have sensing as your auxiliary function, because sensing is too antagonistic to intuition. But he doesn't say that it needs to have an opposite attitude of your dominant. That he doesn't say. So we are going to leave that out. We are not going to speculate on if your auxiliary must have the opposite attitude of your dominant. We are just going to try to say which one of the 4 functions your auxiliary is. And how do you discover this? Again, Jung doesn't provide a model or a testing sheet or a questionnaire or something like that for you to test yourself. I guess it's just a matter of introspection. Take an example that when you analyze the 4 functions, you come to the conclusion that thinking is your most differentiated function, and you also prefer intuition significantly, for example, over sensing. Then you might be thinking dominant, intuition auxiliary. I guess that's the way you're going to have to do it. So in that case, for example, if a person's attitude is introverted, the most differentiated function that can exist without influence of the others or minimal influence of the other function is thinking. And the second most differentiated function would be intuition. Then that type would be something corresponding to, not exactly the same, but corresponding to an INTP in the Myers-Briggs. Which type am I, according to Carl Jung's psychological types? Well, first of all, according to the Myers-Briggs system, I am a very strong introvert, very strong intuitive, moderately strong thinker, very strong judger. So that would be an INTJ in that system. I score as that more or less based on any test I take, including the official MBTI test. So in Jung's world, what am I? Okay, so it's very clear that my attitude is introverted. I am very much focused on the subjective factor. My libido is inward. I'm scared of the external world. I act as if I am afraid that the external world will take power over me. That's how Jung describes introverts. It's very accurate for me. And it has, because of this inner drive of libido in me, I have all the typical traits that you would associate with an introvert. I'm very shy, reserved, except when I'm excited about some sort of knowledge or something like that. Other times I'm reserved. So I'm an introverted attitude type. So what is my most differentiated function? Well, I could just read through the introverted intuitive chapter and just relate to almost all of it when it talks about the introverted intuitive type. That is an indication that maybe intuition is my most differentiated function. Um, when I That's very true, because I usually very much live in the world of possibilities and the future and theory, fantasy, um, all of those things. When people talk, I start speculating over what they really mean, or when I read something, I always try to dig deeper and find a deeper meaning of things. This is something that I do very strongly. I don't like sensation at all. Well, whilst, for example, with thinking and feeling, I have a preference for thinking, but it's not as differentiated. I can't do thinking in a pure form as I can do intuition, because even when I would do some sort of rational decision in thinking, I'll always mix in a little bit of feeling, sentiment into it. I'll always mix in a little bit of intuition into my thinking decisions. Obviously, even when I'm in an intuitive mode, I will be doing a little bit of thinking there. I will be doing a little bit of feeling and registering sensory data, but I will do less than when I'm in intuitive mode. So, based on this sort of self-analysis, I come to that conclusion that intuition is my most differentiated function. Thinking is my second most differentiated function. So that thinking is likely my auxiliary, but it's not a very strong auxiliary, because I will mix in feeling. And when I take Myers-Briggs tests, this is also sort of consistent, because I have a very strong preference for introversion, very strong preference for intuition, moderately strong preference for thinking, and very strong preference for judging. But judging doesn't exist here. But the moderately strong preference for thinking shows that my thinking maybe is not as differentiated as my intuition. So in Jung's world, I am an introverted intuitive type with an auxiliary function of thinking.